An important part of an instrument departure procedure is the required climb gradient. So let's look at the Reno 9 departure and the procedure's required climb gradients so you'll know how to stay safely away from obstructions. Now, a climb gradient is simply a measure of how much altitude you gain for each mile that you travel forward. In order to ensure obstacle clearance, the FAA designs instrument departures so you don't run into anything. And as long as you fly the departure procedure's lateral course guidance and meet climb and altitude requirements for each segment, you'll be safely clear of obstacles. Now, the FAA uses a standard IFR climb gradient of 200 feet per nautical mile. However, sometimes a greater climb gradient may be needed for a specific departure. Typically, this is because of obstructions such as mountains and man-made structures. But if no climb gradient is specified, you just need to meet the standard climb gradient, which again is 200 feet per nautical mile. For pilots, a climb gradient is not very useful because we think, and our vertical speed indicator gives us information in terms of feet per minute. So we have to be able to convert climb gradient in feet per nautical mile to rate of climb in feet per minute. The important variable in figuring this out is your ground speed. And your ground speed will vary greatly depending on the performance capability of the aircraft you're flying. Let's give conversion a try. We'll start off with the FAA standard climb gradient of 200 feet per nautical mile and convert it to feet per minute, climbing at a ground speed of 90 knots, pretty typical for a single-engine airplane. Here's a formula you can use. To figure out your required rate of climb in feet per minute, you take your ground speed, divide it by 60, and then multiply that by your required climb gradient in feet per nautical mile. So using that formula, just plug in your ground speed of 90 knots and the 200 feet per nautical mile. 90 divided by 60 is 1.5. 1.5 times 200 is 300 feet per minute. So at 90 knots ground speed for a climb gradient of 200 feet per nautical mile, you'll need to climb at 300 feet per minute. Now you can use this formula to find out any rate of climb for any climb gradient. Let's look back at the Reno 9 departure and the climb gradient required for runway 16 left and see how this works. Here it says a minimum climb gradient of 730 feet per nautical mile to 10,900 feet is required. You already know a high rate of climb is going to be needed because that climb gradient is a pretty big number. So, say you're flying your new jet and you're expecting a ground speed in the climb of 150 knots as you depart Reno. Now just plug in your ground speed of 150 knots and the 730 feet per nautical mile climb gradient. 150 divided by 60 is 2.5, and 2.5 times 730 is 1,825 feet per minute. It's a good thing you're flying your jet today. Now there's another way to figure out your required rate of climb, and that's with a handy table from the FAA. If you look in the U.S. Terminal Procedures publication, you'll find a rate of climb and descent table. If you know your ground speed and the required climb gradient in feet per nautical mile, then this table will tell you what the climb rate in feet per minute has to be. If your required climb gradient and your ground speed are in the table, it's simple to get that climb rate. For instance, if your required climb gradient was 370 feet per nautical mile and your ground speed is 150 knots, you could just read the required feet per minute where the row and column meet. Here's 370 feet per nautical mile, and here's 150 knots ground speed. You come across and down, and where they meet, you'd get a required rate of climb of 930 feet per minute. But suppose your required climb gradient is not 370, it's 380. You could interpolate using the numbers in the table. But personally, my choice would be to use our easy formula, which you now know how to use to calculate your required rate of climb.